Hey, it's Walt with Linode, and today we're interviewing Hackersploit. You may already be familiar with him from his work as a penetration tester and from the live webinars that he's done at Linode Live. Hackersploit has nearly 550,000 subscribers on his YouTube channel, and coming soon, he's also going to have a security series on this channel. So make sure that you're subscribed to that. So hello Hackersploit, and thanks for coming on.
So thank you for the introduction. As Walt mentioned, I currently work as a penetration tester, so more specifically a network penetration tester. So my role primarily revolves around securing enterprise or company networks and the infrastructure, but I did, get started out in my career with Linux system administration, and then that sort of branched off into security and setting up secure servers, which is one of the things that I do almost on a weekly basis in regards to securing company servers, whether they're running web apps on the cloud or even on-site servers. So yeah, that's primarily what I do.
So which distros of Linux do you prefer? Is it Kali Linux because of all your work in cyber?
The thing with Linux distributions, it all depends on what you're using it for. So on my workstation, I typically use Arch, and then when I'm doing pen testing, I typically use Kali, primarily because Kali has great repositories that have pretty much all the tools that you'll need, and you can build custom ISOs. But of course, for server deployment or web applications, then of course the typical ones would be Ubuntu or Debian or CentOS, which is now Red Hat officially. So yeah.
So do you have different computers with different Linux distros, or do you do everything in one system with like virtualization?
I typically have a host, a main workstation. Then I would typically virtualize all of the other ones, and then of course I have a virtualization server. So all of the other systems I typically virtualize either on my host or on my virtualization server. So for development, I usually work with containers because they're really quick to spin up. Also Docker to a certain extent. And then when I'm working with Kali, I'll typically utilize VMware or VirtualBox. So I like sticking or having one host operating system, and then I virtualize the rest as needed.
So how did you get started with this? Like, what introduced you to it?
Funnily enough, when I first got started, I got my first computer, the operating system that came with it was Ubuntu at the time, which I believe was one of the first versions, or I think version 5, if I'm not mistaken. So just out of choice or luck, I think I got my start, with a computer with Linux as opposed to Windows, which at the time was very unusual, primarily because everyone at the time was using Windows, and the buzz at the time was Windows 7. So I got started with a different philosophy. When you talk about Linux, it's the whole ethos of Linux is making and breaking stuff. So I got started with Linux and started joining forums, and then that's when I got into the various tool development or Linux system programming. So I got started with C and C++, and developing scripts and programs that way for the Linux operating system. And then of course I discovered Black Arch, not Black Arch, but what was it called, Backtrack at the time, which would later turn into Kali Linux. So I got started with Backtrack as at the time that was the most popular pen testing distribution, and that was sort of my foray into penetration testing and security. But I started off with programming and of course writing scripts, and then I slowly got into the whole arena of security, using pen testing tools, getting started with hacking web applications, stuff like that. And then of course my interest slowly went into Linux system administration, and essentially learning how to set up, configure, secure them, how to also troubleshoot servers, how to manage them, how to maintain them. And then of course, because of that influence, I started branching out into vulnerability management of these servers. So sort of analyzing maybe 100 servers, and then making sure that they're adequately patched for O days or any other form of vulnerabilities. So that was my introduction into computing in a general sense.
So before you were pen testing, do you do any social engineering or do you not go that route?
That's exactly what I do. So again, the difference between what I do and what's considered red teaming is the fact that we're typically doing a lot of standardized stuff. So red teaming is pretty rigorous in the approach, or in the approach, in that they pretty much target every aspect of the organization. Whereas with a network penetration tester, you're typically targeting the network, right? And of course, that will involve some level of social engineering, and we do have to actually be on site. And when it comes down to performing network penetration testing and social engineering, we typically, come in as maybe marketing consultants, and of course make our way through the organization if we can. And then, of course, the other way we do it is through phishing emails and trying to get employees to divulge information. So that's the extent of it. As I said, the differences are quite small because, as I just pointed out, with red teaming, you have to be extremely rigorous. You can pretty much come in even at night. You can test all the physical security. So yeah, that's the difference.
So then you always have to be concerned, right? I mean, there are times when the police will show up, because you're caught in the middle of a pen test. So are there any funny stories of when the police will show up and you have to talk yourself out of the situation?
Not really with law enforcement per se. I think the first thing I should say is that whenever you take up a contract like this, is to have the adequate documentation on you, or the permission rather, and having that with you at all times, and ensuring that whenever you're doing your test, you have it actually physically on you in a hard copy, as opposed to saying it's stored on my laptop. Right. So in my case, the only event when this happened was actually we were actually stopped by the actual on-site security there, which was actually kind of weird because I think on that particular day we'd actually tried to go in through the back entrance of a building as electricians or contractors, as it were, under the guise of repairing something. And he's like, no, there's no way you can actually get in without permission from the manager. So our approach was actually flawed from the beginning. We didn't think it through in regards to getting the adequate credentials to get in. So that pretty much botched it from that stage onwards. But again, it was it was actually a good thing that the actual guard there was able to stop that. So as I said, in our case, we typically prepare quite a bit, learn quite a lot about the physical security, what we're likely to expect, and of course we now also try and create some identities for ourselves that are coherent, as opposed to ad hoc character creation on the spot, sort of building a story of yourself. Yeah.
So how did you find Linode in all of this?
Well, I found Linode when I was setting up some of the forums for Hackersploit and some of the other websites that we have. And of course, at the time, I was looking for something a service that was quite robust in regards to the deployment of servers, and a service that could also allow us to actually spin up pre-built environments, things like a LAMP server or a LAMP stack, a server with phpMyAdmin already configured. So that was something that was really attractive to me. And then, of course, the other thing that I really liked was the ability to, or the feature of community scripts that, of course, allowed us to create our own scripts that we can then use and deploy multiple times. And of course, use some of the really, really awesome ones that have been developed by others.
So for someone who was starting out, since you talked about different stacks, are there certain stacks that people should learn, or courses that they should take, or anything specific that students should be focused in on?
Yeah, so I'll discuss this in the context of setting up web applications or Linux servers to host applications of certain kinds, whether they be web applications, email servers, so on and so forth. So the series that I did with Linode, which essentially covered the fundamentals of Linux server security, address this correctly or address it directly. So when we talk about getting started, I think the first thing you need to do is to understand the various stacks that are out there for hosting web applications and how they differ from each other. So when we talk about the LAMP stack, you're primarily going to be dealing with MySQL. That's the key there. And the reason I say that's the key is because that's going to be your database. And the database is typically what's going to be targeted the most. So you need to start thinking of security and server security in the form of what data is being stored on there, what server-side technology is being utilized. Is it PHP? If it's a Windows server, is it ASP.NET? So you need to start understanding that, from a high level. And then, of course, once you have that laid out, once you understand the stack and the technologies that are used, you can then start securing them or securing each of these elements of the stack individually, which is exactly what I did. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing with our next series. So when it comes down to learning Linux security, I think the first thing you need to understand is you need to understand host security. So things like patching your system, working with your network, securing your network through things like IP tables, learning how firewalls work, and setting up a good solid base to work from. And then you can start working with the stacks, whether that may be Apache or Nginx, and of course for the databases, either MySQL or PostgreSQL. So I think understanding how to secure a server at the base level without anything running on it, and then moving on to securing the individual elements of the stack, whether that may be PHP, Java, or even Python.
Okay, so we have a question here from one of our community members. Sandro asks, do you think that following capture the flag walkthroughs is a good way to learn hacking? So what do you think?
Right. So it's sort of been a growing field over the last 3 years, I think, with the advent of platforms like Hack the Box. And CTFs are a great way of actually practicing and testing your skills. In my case, I think that they're really, really good for getting you to know or getting you to learn how to use the tools really well, getting you to understand the tools. Secondly, they help you understand vulnerabilities, right? So CTFs are typically, the end goal is, of course, to find a flag, but the process through which you find a flag is by exploiting a certain vulnerability. So CTFs are really good at showing you how to use the tools to exploit a particular vulnerability. Now, of course, things are very, very different in the wild. You're not going to be dealing with flags, or your end goal in the real world is not going to be a flag or a secret message. You're typically going to be finding vulnerabilities, trying to exploit them, and then, of course, trying to remediate them if you've been contracted by a company to do so. So I think they're a really good way of practicing your skills, learning about vulnerabilities, learning about how to exploit them. But if you want to move on to the next level, I recommend getting started with things like bug bounties, or actually getting started with working in an organization doing actual penetration testing, because it differs quite a bit.
Okay, great, perfect. And are there any certifications that you think that someone should use one over the other?
Yeah, it all depends on the path you're looking to take, or the career that you're interested in. So again, if you're looking at a management position within cybersecurity, then of course I recommend going down the CISSP route. If you're getting into network penetration testing, then of course the CompTIA certifications like Network Plus, Linux Plus, and then of course CCNA, and then of course to sort of wrap it all up, I would recommend taking the OSCP. That's if you're a penetration tester, which again, the OSCP is very hands-on, is exactly what companies are looking for now. So again, it depends on the route you're going to be taking within cybersecurity. If you're taking a hands-on approach to pen testing, then I recommend those certifications. If you're doing things like blue teaming and defense, then of course certifications like Security Plus and the other certifications that deal with the SIEM or SEIM system, so QRadar, stuff like that.
Okay, and so then taking that further, so in this new pandemic world, you can't physically go to a location. So what's your day-to-day life like right now? Like, is it doing just network testing until things start to loosen back up again?
Yeah, so typically what you'll find with companies now, and especially large companies, with more than 50 employees, what's happening is they're now migrating all their business operations to the cloud, which again opens up a new dimension in regards to security. So we've been focusing on cloud security now, and we've been getting clients, essentially asking us to help them secure their servers, as we've already been doing their cloud infrastructure. And then, of course, helping them secure their platforms, because they're running, tons of platforms now, online platforms with employees each having to log into these platforms. So all of these things pose new security threats. So I think what's happened in post-pandemic is companies have started to adapt to the post-pandemic world by migrating all their business operations to the cloud, and that's helped them streamline a lot of things. And I think it's going to be the case moving forward. And physical locations will actually take a while now, I think, to return to normal. But we've successfully been able to adapt into this new paradigm, which is growing rapidly. So cloud, the cloud is now starting to be adopted at a increasingly rapid pace by companies.
So are there any projects that you're working on right now? So like, what are the next 6 months like for you?
Well, that's an interesting question. We've primarily been trying to build our own platform for our content, our free content, that is, and we're expected to have it released in Q1 of this year. So that's something that I'm really interested in. I've also been working personally on a custom Linux kernel. That's just a personal project. But yeah, that's pretty much it in regards to personal projects. As I said, in regards to training, we have a few courses coming out in Q1, and of course we also have the Linode series that's also scheduled to come out, I think, by April. So yeah, there's tons of stuff that we're working on.
Have you ever recoded something, like taken an RC toy car or something and tweaked the radio waves that it was transmitting?
Well, if you're referring to hardware hacking, I think my experimentation was primarily on the Xbox 360 and probably, I think, the PlayStation Portable, where I was sort of reverse engineering some of the exploits that were created for those platforms, and then of course trying to develop my own homebrew applications for those particular platforms. So trying to essentially test the system, see what I can get out of it, and trying to make it do all kinds of cool stuff. But that's as far as I've gotten. Of course, I've also been trying to play around with the Nintendo Switch, which is an interesting platform. But I typically now only work on the software side of things. But hardware hacking is really, really interesting.
I had no idea that you hacked a Nintendo Switch. So Sandra asked another question. What's the best way of learning to write in assembly code?
Well, that's a good question. I would typically just point out the way I learned how to write assembly, which was to write simple applications for the 8086 emulator, which is a free program you can download on Windows. And it's a great way of actually learning to develop small little programs that do basic stuff, and of course how to write games. I think writing games is probably the best way of understanding how assembly code works in regards to the registers and stuff like that. So if you want to learn assembly, I don't think I have any books that I would recommend, because I didn't learn it from any books. But I would say the best way of learning assembly is by actually writing projects, as opposed to trying to learn the syntax, because assembly doesn't make any sense, linguistically speaking. It's not it doesn't have any notes of a pseudocode or anything like that. So the only way you'll understand it is by actually using it.
Okay, so that wraps it up. And thanks so much for your insight today. That was a huge help. And for those watching, subscribe here on Linode's YouTube channel for Hackersploit server series coming soon. And that's it. So thanks again, Hackersploit. We appreciate that.
Thank you very much for the welcome. Really appreciate it.